Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God. I want to talk about personal Christian trials and lessons, some things I've encountered over the years. Now, what's it like to be a true Philadelphian Christian? Once you're baptized, will everything go well? Will life be a bowl of cherries without any pits? No. While the just will live by faith, Christians are going to have tests and trials. I'm going to go through some of my own throughout this sermon, but first let's start by going to the book of James. James chapter 1, starting in verse 2. And this will be from the New King James Version of the Bible. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So yes, there will be trials. And if you're faithful, your faith will be tested. While patience has its perfect work, it doesn't always feel good dealing with the trials that we go through to help build patience and godly character. Striving toward perfection is not easy. But if we're going to be faithful to God our Father, we can expect to encounter things that maybe we don't want to. This is actually talked about in the book of Hebrews. So you want to go back to the 12th chapter of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 12. I'll start in verse 4. We read, "You have not resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son he receives," which means we're all subject to that. Verse 7, "If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom the Father doesn't chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all become partakers, then you're illegitimate, not sons. Furthermore, we've had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Should we not be much more readily in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For indeed, for a few days chasten us has seemed best for them. But he," that's God our Father, "for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness." So there's reasons God does this, so we can be partakers of his holiness, being his family. "Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and feeble knees. If you're not sure, have faith in God and go and take the steps you're supposed to take. And make straight paths for your feet, so that which is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this come defiled." Now I'd like to go through personal trials I've had, as well as some family members, one or two family members, as well as some lessons I think I've gained through them. First of all, when I was 13, I remember praying that God would lead me to his truth, and essentially the most correct church, the right church, no matter what it was or what I had to do. I'd been raised Roman Catholic, but our family had stopped attending about 2 years before. By the way, perhaps I should mention I did not have overly strict Roman Catholic parents like some on the internet who don't know me or my parents have claimed. My parents were and are decent people who are Roman Catholic. We get along. Some who also don't know me have complained online. I don't talk about my parents much in sermons, like there's some nefarious reason. It's simply not true. Anyway, since our sermons are mainly about church doctrine, church history, Bible prophecy, and Christian living, in general there's not a whole lot of reason to bring up my parents or my siblings, or most of my other relatives, because they're not in the Church of God. Anyway, getting back to the idea of the right church, I knew enough about the Roman Catholic faith to understand that I was doomed if I didn't go to what they call Mass, church services regularly, as well as go to confession. So I started to read the Bible. Well, actually, it was the New Testament. Someone had given my youngest brother one, and he either gave it to me because he thought I might read it, or because I had a really small bookcase in the house. It's probably about, about that big, I guess. So I had a small bookcase. And so anyway, I started to read it. And when I did, there were a couple of developments. Since it was the New Testament, I started with Matthew's Gospel. And by the time I got through, I don't know, 5, 10 chapters, no more than that, I'm pretty sure, I realized that the Roman Catholic Church wasn't anything like I was seeing. The second development was my father caught me reading it. Yes. Why would I read the Bible? Why are you doing that? And I said, well, I want to know what was in it. And left it at that, and then we never really had a discussion about it. Now, because of my Roman Catholic upbringing, I thought only possible Christians were Roman Catholics or Protestants. And so I figured, well, if the Roman Catholics aren't the right church or the original church, it must be the Protestants. Well, as it turns out, my parents had my brothers and I attend a week-long Protestant summer camp around this time. So I got some exposure to Protestantism, and I also started to listen to Protestant radio. And I started to learn, by the way, that Protestants did not have unity of doctrine. During this time period, I also heard Garner Ted Armstrong of the old Worldwide Church of God on the radio. And he brought up topics like what happens to babies when they die, talked about things like heaven, and these were things that Protestants either didn't biblically address or they addressed wrong. Now, I gave what amounted to tithes to various radio preachers, including one or more that primarily helped support the hungry. Now, when I was about 15, another student that I knew, he recommended I speak to some of his older friends about what was wrong with the Worldwide Church of God. Because when we would talk at lunchtime, actually, I'd bring up some stuff from there. And he didn't like it because it didn't go along with his understanding of what Christianity was. So I ended up meeting with one or two people off and on for several months who tried to dissuade me about Church of God doctrine. Now, when I was 16 and able to drive, I started to attend the Salem Bible Church in Salem, Michigan, and I started to tithe to them. But one time in services, toward the end, we were singing some song about what we're going to do in heaven. So afterwards, I pulled the pastor aside, and I said, the Bible teaches that the holy city, New Jerusalem, is going to come down from heaven to the earth. And he agreed, by the way, that I was right. And I said, then why are we singing this song about what we're going to do in heaven? And he said, because people liked the song. Well, that was a totally unacceptable answer, and that was the last time I actually ever attended services at Salem Bible Church. Now, I mentioned some Protestants who tried to dissuade me from the Worldwide Church of God. And they gave me some book. And that book supposedly was going to disprove Worldwide Church of God doctrines. I didn't realize it at the time, but I since realized that frequently when people discount Church of God doctrines, they point to scriptures without quoting them, or just assume that you're just going to go along with what they believe. They don't really disprove it. Well, even at age 15 or 16, when I was reading through this book, I would go and I would check what it said to the Bible and look, and it's like, this did not disprove it. They don't like what the church teaches, but they haven't disproven it. So I thought, okay, the book is in error, so the Worldwide Church of God is not necessarily in error. So a lesson I learned was to pay more attention to the Bible than what people who wrongly claim to base their doctrines on it. I've held up some books and booklets in the past, and I'm going to do this now. I have a book that we've written called Beliefs of the Original Catholic Church. Being brought up Roman Catholic, I thought they had ties to the original church, and this book will go into detail quoting from Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Catholic scriptures and people they call saints to explain why actually the continuing Church of God holds more of the beliefs of the original Catholic Church than the Greco-Roman Catholics do. In terms of Protestants, I was under the misconception that they believed in sola scriptura, which means the Bible alone. Where they got their doctrine, and I found actually no, they got some compromised doctrines from the Greco-Romans. Oh, by the way, these books and any other books or booklets I hold up, other than my personal Bible, are available free online at www.ccog.org. That's ccog.org. Go into the literature tab under books and booklets, and you can see the covers of the books. Click on them. We don't ask for your email address. We don't ask for money. We don't ask for anything. You can just read them and check out what we teach the Bible. Oh, and by the way, if you want a really short booklet, just to compare, the Protestant one's got a lot of details you really want to know. There's one that's a lot less. Where's a true Christian church today? Which I believe will help anybody who's actually sincere and be willing to be led by God. If you're not willing to be led by God, it really doesn't matter what we teach or don't teach. All right, well, as it turns out, I started to listening to other ones on the radio, and sometimes I would watch them on television. Around this time of our life, our parents got a couple of small portable black and white TVs. So one of my brothers and I got one, my other brothers got one in their room. And so I started to watch some programs, Worldwide Church of God's program. I also watched stuff from the Seventh-day Adventists that I remember. I started to get the Plain Truth magazine back then. I actually had my own private post office box in my own name, even at 15 or 16. I also received literature from the SDAs, as well as something that I found out was called the United Community Church of Glendale, plus also some other Protestant groups. Anyway, I wasn't sure what church was right, so at age 17, I enlisted in the Air Force, and I had my basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, where we had the Feast of Tabernacles a couple years back. And while there, oddly, in the military, they told us we should go to church. So twice they brought us to some kind of a Protestant service. Then later, I noticed, through some kind of a flyer or some listing, that they had a Church of God there. And they met on Saturday. Now, I'd never been to a Church of God service, so I jumped at the chance. Now, it was very poorly attended. It was just me and some other guy. Plus, there was a minister and his assistant. The minister was a bit too Pentecostal for me, and when he about said the word Jesus 30 or so times in a row, maybe 150 times, 50 times, I didn't count, but it was just, he wouldn't stop. I left. Because by that time I had enough knowledge of the Bible to realize what Jesus said in Matthew 6, verses 7 and 8. Jesus said, "When you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. Therefore, do not be like them." And I'm seeing this guy who claims to be a Church of God pastor or minister, or this is supposed to be a Church of God service, in his prayer, continually saying Jesus. I mean, it wasn't like, Jesus help me, Jesus, no, just Jesus, 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 Jesus. Of course, he was yelling and louder and all that stuff. Now, by this stage in my life, I had read at least part of Herbert W. Armstrong's 1973 edition of his autobiography. And I knew he had sometimes encountered Sabbatarian Pentecostals. Now, I'd never run across a Pentecostal before. Anyway, Herbert Armstrong was opposed to them truly being in the Church of God. And I agreed he was right. Because, again, it's not scriptural to be saying what this guy was doing. So, that encounter was an important lesson for me, and that is, it does matter what Church of God you're part of. Just because they call themselves Church of God, just because they go to church on Saturday, doesn't necessarily mean, one, they're part of the true church, or two, they're the most faithful part of the true church. So this Pentecostal experience had a lasting impression on me. And I remember when the old Worldwide Church of God entered apostasy and various ministers split off and they formed various COG branches. Anyway, going back to myself, after basic training, I went to a technical school on accounting, actually, at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. And sometimes I'd go to the library when I had free time, and I would do church research. I remember that I eliminated the Mormons once I found out they were Trinitarian. And that also might have been a reason I eliminated the SDAs, but at this stage I don't remember anymore. Now, by the summer of that year, I started to try to keep the Sabbath. This is in Wichita Falls, at the base. I didn't know any services to go to. There was no internet, by the way. I wasn't sure how to keep the Sabbath, but I tried on my own. And while I'm trying to figure this stuff out, where I'm at, the leaders of our area decided that the female trainees were spending too much time in the male dormitories. So I was given an assignment to sit guard at one of the entrances from time to time, including on the Sabbath. Now, to justify this in my own mind, I remembered that there were guards on the Sabbath somewhere in the Old Testament, so I figured, okay, that's okay to do. Now, in hindsight, I don't think it was, but I was new when I was only 17. Anyway, so for my 4-hour shift, I thought, okay, well, all I have to really do, because I'm not really working, is sit at the spot at the entrance by the door. Actually, I think I sat on steps. It wasn't a chair. And I had a Bible, and then I would basically kind of just read the Bible for my 4 hours. And I don't know if any females ever tried to enter while I was there or not. If so, I would say they were not allowed, but I don't remember even having to do that. Anyway, about a month after that, I moved to California because I was assigned to a place called Vandenberg Air Force Base, which, by the way, they've slightly changed the name. It's now called Vandenberg Space Force Base. And because the Bible taught that we're supposed to rest from even to even, I asked a Protestant, well, what does that mean? Oh, that means from evening to evening. So I remember that, as far as I knew, evening began at 6 p.m. So I started to keep the Sabbath from 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday. And that's what I was doing at the base. Anyway, shortly after I was assigned to Vandenberg, and I got there, I wrote a minister of the Worldwide Church of God, and actually I wrote the Worldwide Church of God in Pasadena and asked, could I talk to a minister? And then they had a minister who wrote me back, and he said, they sent this to me, but I'm not the right one. There's another guy. So go ahead and contact him and meet with him. And they gave me a telephone number, and I would have had to use a payphone because I didn't have a phone, and certainly didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have them back then, at least most people didn't. So after meeting with this minister, he invited me to attend church services, and I said I would. So obviously it was all going to go great, and I'll just be able to do that. No, my car broke down, so I couldn't go. My transmission went. Cost me pretty much all the money I had. Anyway, finally the car gets repaired. Now this is, I don't know, a few days before Christmas. Turns out that the Sabbath was on December 25th that year. So anyway, the closest Worldwide Church of God group that met was met in a school called Ocean View Elementary in a town I'd never heard of at the time called Arroyo Grande, which is one of the 5 cities in this particular region where I actually am now. Anyway, when I got to this school, I couldn't figure out any place where church was. And it's like, huh? So I walked around the whole ground, and I didn't see anything, and I didn't see any entrance, I didn't see anything, and I walked around again, and I still didn't see anything. Now I remembered when the Protestants tried to talk me out of the Worldwide Church of God, they told me the church was secretive. So I was wondering, is that why I can't find this? But I couldn't find it, and I spent a lot of time looking, so I went home. After I got to where I was living, I made a telephone call and didn't get an answer. So I think, wow, what a secretive group. Finally, I made contact. And he said to me, yeah, I was wondering if maybe you would come then. And I told him the reason I hadn't come before was my car broke down. So it wasn't for me to go, I guess, when I thought I should go. And then the minister told me that they wouldn't allow the church to use the cafeteria during the Christmas break, so they were meeting somewhere in the town called San Luis Obispo. So he said also the next week, which happened to be New Year's, the 1st, I'm supposed to go there for church services, so I did. Now, you might say, well, why are you giving this sermon? Well, it turns out that yesterday I was counseling a prospective member and told her the guard story, and I told her about me not knowing the Sabbath, what time it was. I thought it was from 6 to 6, and some other things. And we talked for about the length of a sermon, and she asked a lot of questions, and she said that by going through all these stories, it helped her. So I'm hoping that this will help members or prospective members just go through some information. Plus, some have asked more information about my coming into the church and various things associated with me. So I thought that, okay, fine. This would be a great time to do it. I wasn't planning on doing it, so I switched my sermon subject kind of at the last minute. Because she said she found the stories inspiring, and she thought others might like to hear them. Now, while I was in the military, I counseled for baptism. Now, the minister asked, well, what do you do? I said, I work in payroll. I've got normal office hours. I work from Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. And now, by the time I'm getting close to getting baptized, it's early spring. Now, about this time, I knew about sunset being the Sabbath, but by that time of the year, sunset was after 5 o'clock, so it didn't affect really work. Now, starting the fall of the year, I did leave work at sunset. Even though I was in the military, I talked to my boss, so I had to leave early, and he let me do it, so that was fine. Well, anyway, as it turns out, in terms of tests and trials, on a Friday, which was the day before I was going to, Thursday or Friday, I get baptized, and then they tell me on one of those days that I'm going to have to go to work on the Sabbath because some inspection is coming up and everybody's got to come in. So I told my supervisor I wasn't going to do it. You know, it says in Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. We really are supposed to do that. I didn't tell him that scripture, of course. Well, my supervisor, who I socialized with, we got along well, he said I had to show up. And I said I wouldn't. He again said I had to. Hitting it, you know, maybe the only other option was jail or something. Well, I told him, okay, well, I'm not going to, so I'm going to figure out how to get out of the military. So his phone rang, so he picked up the phone, and I walked down the hall. Now, I was in a building that had 3 big wings in it, and the base personnel office was in one of those. So I came back, and my boss says to me, well, where were you? I said, I told him I told you I'm not going to work on the Sabbath. And let's see, I'm 18 at the time. Okay, and I am trying to figure out how to get out of the Air Force. I went over there and asked him what I have to do to get out. He was like, what? He was just shocked. So I didn't think I was that serious about religion. As a matter of fact, around that time I remember talking to a career counselor at the military, and he was asking me about it, and I said, I don't think I can stay in because it's Sabbath and holy days or whatever. And he's like, well, you can't God doesn't expect you to let religion get in the way of your job or your income, your career. And I didn't agree with him. Anyway, getting back to my supervisor, I was a pretty good worker. We got along fine. He didn't want me out, so some reason, how or another, he decided I didn't have to come in. Now, anyway, somewhere around the time of my baptism, I learned about second tithe. Now, I was probably making about, I don't know, $500 a month at the time. And I started to save some. But guess what? Yes, my car broke down again. And this time, the cost to fix it, which was similar to the other time, was about $500. And I have the money. And it would have probably cost about $1,000, but I had a cousin who was a mechanic, and he did all the labor for me, but I had to buy a new engine block or short block or whatever it was called. And so he worked on it, and anyway, I had to go to the credit union to get a loan. And I did. And I'm thinking, how am I going to be able to do second tithe and first tithe, make my rent, make my car payment, and even eat? So what did I do? I actually went without some meals at the time, but mainly I tried to figure out a cheaper way to eat. You'll love this one. I'm not recommending that you do this. I bought a large bag of whole wheat, and I bought a small bottle of chili powder. And it turns out, don't know why, but somebody at church services gave me a jar of honey about this big. So what I did is I'd put wheat and hot water in a thermos. And I would do this in the morning and in the evening. So I did that at night. In the morning, I poured the wheat out. I put a little honey on it. That was my breakfast. Then I put the wheat in as hot water again. And then at dinner, I would sprinkle some chili powder in it, and that was my dinner. And so this went off and on for, I don't know, a few weeks. I wasn't exclusively eating this. I was eating some other things. But I certainly remember that's one of the things I did to try to save some money. I also moved out of where I was to a cheaper room, another place, in another town, and that was actually closer to work. By this time I wasn't living on the base. Anyway, between those two moves, I tithed and collected second and saved the second tithe. Anyway, I ended up with about $300 in second tithe. And I went to Squaw Valley for the Feast of Tabernacles, and that was, I don't know, like a 10-hour, maybe 11-hour drive away. It turns out there was a student from San Luis Obispo who wanted to go to the feast and needed a ride. So I gave him a ride. And back at that time, you were back, this would be in 77, the old Worldwide Church of God would actually make your housing reservations for you. You just tell them what you needed. And they assigned me a roommate because they knew I didn't have any money. I didn't think I could pay for it all. Turns out whoever they assigned as a roommate didn't show up. So I had to pay for the entire lodging myself. Now the church actually asked me if I needed some assistance at that stage because they told me this guy's going to show up. Anyway, he didn't show up. Anyway, it turns out I didn't eat as well at that Feast of Tabernacles as I've eaten at other ones. But ended up having enough money that I threw in another $20 or $30 to my last Great Day Holy Day offering as excess second tithe. At Squaw Valley, by the way, this is the only time I got to see Garner Ted Armstrong in person. Well, anyway, the next year for the feast, I had about twice as much money because this time I'd been collecting second tithe for a year instead of like 6 months, 5 or 6 months. So I had probably, after the tithe, probably around $600 or so. And I went to Fresno for the feast, and there was somebody else who I knew. I think it was going to UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, and didn't have any money to go to the feast, so I had him come with me. So I drove him up there, and I covered most of his expenses. And the next year, he and I went to Tucson for the feast, and he didn't have a job, and I was in the military, and I did, so I paid for most everything here. Anyway, we got there, my car overheated. Now this is the same car I had before with the other problems. And at this stage, I used to joke that my car got more miles to a gallon of gas than it did to a gallon of water. It was basically, and how did you drive to Tucson? Well, the car was okay unless I stopped. When I stopped it would just drain water. Anyway, we get to Tucson, and my radiator really is shot this time. So this guy and I go to a junkyard, find a radiator, bought it. I think it was cost us like $60. And he put it in because he was better at mechanical things than me. So we had transportation during the feast, and we were able to come back. And it's the Tucson, by the way, feast site. I actually met Stanley Rader in person, talked to him, and I also saw Herbert W. Armstrong in person. Now, as far as tithing goes, the prospective member I was talking to yesterday, she had some questions. And she basically wanted me to explain tithing. She wanted some examples. And I said, okay, here's what the old Worldwide Church of God taught. Let's say you make $20 an hour. You work for 40 hours in a week, you get $800. That's your gross pay. The Worldwide Church of God said, okay, you have to send them $80. You also take another $80 and set that aside for yourself for the Feast of Tabernacles as your second tithe. The old Worldwide Church of God taught that it should be on your gross and not your net, because they said if you tithed on your net income, you were showing that the government had claimed your money before God, and God is sovereign. Well, I and others in the Worldwide Church of God were not convinced that was accurate. And in time, Worldwide Church of God changed on that. And in the Continuing Church of God, we have as well. So I said to her, okay, so suppose you work the same week, you gross $800, but after Social Security and state and local income tax, you get like $65. Okay, so we teach that, and a couple other church COGs I was in also teach that you can tithe on your net pay. So you would send $65 and then hold $65 for the Feast of Tabernacles. And one of the reasons why I and others concluded that tithing on your net pay as opposed to your gross pay was correct were twofold. One, there are some countries that if you make enough money, they take something like 60 to 80% of your income. So if you tithe on your gross, you have no money at all. But secondly, and I think for this purpose more importantly, we have no choice. Okay, Jesus said we're supposed to pay taxes. Jesus gave us an example of paying taxes. We're supposed to imitate him, and we do, so we pay taxes. We have no choice on income tax, okay? You say, oh, you can work on deductions and stuff. Afterwards, they take what they are going to take. It's not voluntary. They call it voluntary in the United States, by the way. It's not voluntary because you don't pay, they'll take your assets or even jail you. So we have no control over that. It's not our money. The government decides that they get it for the privilege of us working, or whatever it is that whatever rationale they come up with. So another topic that came was this gal asked about her whether or not she was covered by her parents' tithing. And she is a young adult and has her own income, and I said no. And she said she recently concluded that after reading some articles I had written. And when I counseled her before, I also suggested that she read the free booklet, Christians, Ambassadors for the Kingdom of God, Biblical Instructions on Living as a Christian. And she read this, said, well, it didn't have a huge amount about tithing, but it did mention it, so she went to the cogwriter.com website, read some articles we had, so she had a better idea. So she started to figure that kind of thing out. Again, she asked me how to calculate it, and I did. So she found that helpful, and that's one of the reasons I did that in this particular sermon, hoping that you would all find it helpful as well. Anyway, when I was in the military, I went to school at night. Now, my grade point average suffered a little bit because I always took time off for the Feast of Tabernacles. But I got through my classes. Now, when I was 20 years old, I was named Base Airman of the Quarter over at Vandenberg Air Force Base. So out of, I don't know, 2,000 people, I got this award. I was in the newspapers and blah, 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 blah. Well, shortly thereafter, somebody in the Air Force concluded that people like me who worked in offices were useless in times of war, and that we needed what they called a war skill. So they had a program called War Skill. And so they wanted me to go and get some additional training shooting a rifle. Me and others, not just me, of course. And I shot a gun one time in the Air Force at basic training, and I think I shot a second time regarding this. Well, anyway, they had this period of training they wanted to do for 2 weeks. But my supervisor, the different one at this time, my boss now, wouldn't let me do it. He said I was too valuable, I couldn't do it. Now, I wanted to do it then because this was probably like in August, and I knew the Feast of Tabernacles was coming up. And I didn't want delays. Then they tried to get me again, and my commanding officer stopped it, said no, I was too valuable, too important, I couldn't do it. Well, third time, somebody higher up than my commanding officer said, no, we've already given you two delays. He has to go. And unfortunately, it's exactly what I was concerned about. It was going to be around feast time. Matter of fact, the first day of the war skill training was supposed to be the Day of Atonement. Then, again, it was supposed to last 2 weeks, and they said I had to be there. Now, I don't want to do this, of course, and I'm not going to do this. And so, let's see, I was 20 at the time. And so they had me meet with my first sergeant. And so I'm meeting with him, and not my squadron commander, who I thought I'd be meeting with, but it was just the first sergeant. And he says to me, you have to show up. You have to do this. And I said I wouldn't do it. He says, well, we checked with the base legal office, and we checked with the base chapel office, that's the chaplain office, the religious part on the base, and both of them said you have no legal ground to stand on, so you are going to be here or jail. You are going to show up. And I said no. And so I knew that they didn't dislike me, all right? Because I was squadron airman of the quarter, and then for the entire base, the airman of the quarter recently. So I knew they didn't hate me. I knew they weren't out to get me. So I prayed about this while I'm there. So no, I did not drop to my knees and put my arms up or anything like that. I just prayed silently, and you can read that, other things like that in the Bible, such as, for example, Nehemiah, when the king asked him something. I prayed, what else should I do about this? So then I said to him, my first sergeant, I looked in the eye and said, I would die for my country, but I wouldn't kill for it. He said, huh? I said, look, I have guns. Because at the time, I was a hunter. I'd hunted in Michigan, and I had a shotgun at base armory. When you're on the base, you're not allowed to have a gun that you can go and get, because people get mad. But you can go and ask for it. You couldn't have one in your dormitory room or anything. I said, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I will not hold a gun or I will not shoot a gun, because I grew up in Michigan, we hunted, I'm not afraid of guns. And I said, if you assign me to guard the entrance to the base, or you stick me in front of a missile silo, by the way, they have missile silos at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The missiles aren't armed with nuclear weapons, but they do have the capability of launching those. They were going to do so. I said, I will stand in front of those and I will hold a gun. But if you think I'm going to shoot somebody who wants to get in the base or is around the nuclear, potentially nuclear silo, if you think I'm going to shoot them, not going to happen. Well, suddenly the countenance of my first sergeant changed. Instead of being kind of stern, you don't have a choice, blah, 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 he realized, that I did have a legal out. So there's no way they should train someone like me to be a security policeman, which is what they were going to train me to do as my war skill, if I wouldn't shoot anybody. So that happened. So I ended up, by the way, keeping the Day of Atonement, which was this was probably on a Friday, because I thought Atonement was on Monday, so I thought Monday I was going to be in jail. But no, instead of being in jail on the Day of Atonement, I kept the Day of Atonement. And then went to the Feast of Tabernacles that year, and everything was fine. Now they offered me the option to get out of the military at that instant. So this was, I forgot what month the feast was that year. This is probably around 1st of October, somewhere around October of that year. And I could have done that and collected unemployment, and that kind of would have been the easy way. But I thought that I only have 4, 5, 6 months left on my enlistment. If they want to force me out, I'll go. But otherwise, I'll just wait and just till my enlistment ends. So I didn't get out, so I was still in, so I thought everything was fine. Now, getting to where I've only got 2 or 3 months left in the Air Force. Now, my commanding officer now says we have an inspection coming up, similar to what happened to me 3 years before. Except the commanding officer had all of us together, all of us in that wing, all the accounting people, and said, all the military, and I was military, all will show up tomorrow and there will be no exceptions, and you will do this or whatever. So I'm thinking, oh no, maybe I did the wrong thing. Maybe I should have gotten out when they wanted to force me out. So I meekly come up to his office, and his door was open, and so I just slightly knocked on it. Can I come in? Yes. I said, well, you made this announcement that everybody has to come in tomorrow, and I can't do that. And he says, oh, I didn't mean you. I'm thinking, he said no exceptions. I figured, I figured that meant me too. And he said, no, you don't have to come in. So we knew you were going to go. So I guess I was known by this stage. Now anyway, when I was just over 21, I finished my enlistment. And by this time, by the way, I had a bachelor's degree in accounting, plus 4 years of accounting experience. And when I was in the Air Force, I worked during the day 5 days a week. I kept the Sabbath. And I went to college or university Monday through Friday, not Monday through Friday, Monday through Thursday in the evening. Occasionally I think I had a Friday lunch class once, but ignoring that, I basically went to school Monday through Thursday evening. I kept the Sabbath. I mostly did homework on Sunday. I would tend to go out on Saturday nights and sometimes Sunday during the day. Now I believe, and believed then too, that keeping the Sabbath gave me the blessing that allowed me to have the energy and the focus that I needed to get done what I needed to do. And I had concluded that if I'm going to be a tithe payer, which I was, I've been basically all my life, and also have to pay taxes, because some of your pay in the military, by the way, was not taxable. Some was, most of it was, but not all of it was. I needed to have a degree in order to get a job that I thought how much it would pay, so I'd be even, at least, with the Air Force when I got out. And that's what happened. I got a job, I think it was $7.81 an hour, is what it ended up being, which might not sound like a lot now, but it was adequate for me at the time. And then I got out. Now, while I was in the Air Force, once in the Rio Grande congregation, someone seriously asked me if I attended Worldwide Church of God because I wanted to marry a woman in the church. I told him, oh, why don't you look around? The only unmarried women there were either children or they're all older than my mother. Now, I knew it would be wrong to marry outside the church. And I also realized to find somebody to marry would be much harder than for Protestants or Roman Catholics, because there's lots more of them. Now, I did meet and sometimes go out with single women I met at the Feast of Tabernacles, but wasn't really moved in a way to have much or any further contact with them. I think I wrote one of them once or something afterwards, but beyond that, nothing. Now, at the time, by around 1980, after I got out of the Air Force, I moved in with a guy. He had well, actually, he and I were we looked for a place. We got a 2-bedroom apartment. And he and I got along fine, but he wanted me to go to a singles function that was about 100 miles away after the Sabbath. Now, he was in his 50s, and he'd met a woman in her 50s at the Feast of Tabernacles that year. And she was putting on a function at her house. Now, I told him I didn't want to go, because I figured it'd basically just be a bunch of older people. Now on Friday night before this event was going to be, he and I went to have dinner at some church member's house. Now, the husband there asked me about getting married. And I said, well, there aren't any prospects in Rio Grande. And he asked me if I was praying about it. And I said, no, I didn't pray for a wife. I tended to pray for more things like building character, supporting the work, spiritual gifts, etc. Not making personal requests like, okay, God, give me a wife, God, give me a car, or a car that works, etc. Well, he suggested I pray about it, so next morning I did. So later, it might have been after Sabbath services that day, I told my roommate, fine, I'll go down with you to this singles function. So this is down in a town called Thousand Oaks. So we get there. Remember, this guy's in his 50s. And we get there, and for some reason we turn over into the kitchen, and there were only older people. Mainly a few women who were basically in their wheelchairs, who were at least in their 60s or higher. I told myself, well, that's what you thought was going to happen. But, you might as well make the best of it. I didn't mind talking to older women and seniors and said, okay, fine, this would be fine. Not quite what I had for a singles evening, but okay. Well, anyway, I leave the kitchen after a little while, and I go into the dining room because there's a table with some food on it. And while I'm over there, this guy in his 20s introduced himself to me. And he said, by the way, there were also younger people in a back room of the house. And I said, oh, okay, because as far as I knew, there was nobody anywhere near my age there. And so he ended up introducing me to my wife, Joyce, who I later married. And by the way, I don't want to give the impression that that was my only option, that I just settled because of that. There's actually another gal there, who I won't mention her name, who actually acted fairly interested in me. And there were some other women there as well. And there were other gals I had met from time to time in the Santa Barbara congregation and down in Pasadena. So I knew there were females somewhere in the church that were possible. But anyway, so he introduced me to Joyce. We went to a church function the next week or so. And now Joyce had been getting the Plain Truth magazine for years and had attended Worldwide Church of God services when she lived in New Jersey, and later when she moved to California and to the Reseda congregation. And she was baptized a few months after we met. We later got engaged, and we got married when I was just shy of 23. Also, when I was still 22, and before we were married, I think I became the youngest certified management accountant in the history of that program. It wasn't because I was smarter than everybody else, but because despite going to the Feast of Tabernacles and missing school, and the fact I did not take a class on how to pass this test, I learned enough between that and the fact I had enough work experience. I ended up being the youngest, because typically people don't get their bachelor's degree till they're 21 or 22. Then they need a couple years of valid work experience in order to become a certified management accountant and also pass the test. And I had had the military 4 years counted. So by the time I was 22, I was a certified management accountant. Now, getting back to church matters regarding with my wife. By the way, we do have a booklet on dating. Talks about marriage a little bit in here as well. The old Worldwide Church of God had recommended long courtships and short engagements. They felt for a lot of reasons that was better. Now, we were engaged in May, and I looked as to when the Feast of Tabernacles was going to be this year, and found out it was going to be in October. And I told Joyce that I think this is the only time we'll be able to afford a honeymoon. So with her second tithe and my second tithe, we were able to scrape enough together to go to Kauai. He said, wait a second, you just scraped together. Couldn't you have gone somewhere else? Yes. But remember, we lived in California. California is not that far from Hawaii. And I also, by the way, to make sure we could afford it, bought this book called Hawaii on $25 a Day. And we use that book a lot. We go to really cheap restaurants, find free activities and whatever, but we did actually get to go to the feast in Kauai. Now, for the first 7 or 8 years we were married, we could only afford to go out to a restaurant to eat probably about once every other month. Other than that, the Feast of Tabernacles. And third tithe years are also pretty tough, but we made it through it anyway. And for the first 20, 25 years or so of our marriage, I probably would say the Feast of Tabernacles was pretty close to our only vacation, if you want to call it that. Because generally speaking, we couldn't afford other trips. Now, as far as the Feast of Tabernacles goes, I've kept 45 feasts in about as many locations. It's not that we didn't go to any location more than once. We went to Anchorage twice. We went to Kauai a few times. And in 2022, Branson, we're planning on going there. That'll be the second time there. But because of being in the Continuing Church of God, some years we go to 2 sites. Like last year, Joyce and I and our son David went to Tennessee and Puerto Rico. And sometimes we've been to California and New Zealand. We've been to St. Louis in Canada, etc. So we've been to different places, and so probably kept the feast in at least that many locations. And I want to go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. So now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Now, despite trials and difficulties from time to time, including, again, jail and other things that could have affected me, we still kept the feast, kept the holy days, didn't work on the Sabbath. And does it mean we never had any problems? Oh, we still had issues from time to time. As a matter of fact, the first job I got, once I got out of the Air Force, I had an opportunity to look really good for doing something, and I was supposed to fly to Colorado and bring some report and stuff we were working on, and didn't get done in time. So then they wanted me to go on the Sabbath, so I didn't do it. So somebody else got credit for my work, basically, because I had done most of the work, and that can happen, but still wouldn't violate the Sabbath. Now, after we were married, Joyce ended up getting a job at this one particular company after a while. And while she was there, they decided that she could not be off for the Feast of Tabernacles. And we explained that she was going to be gone, and they said nope. They decided that legally they could get rid of her for that. And they did. And so we had a little bit income hit when that happened. So we've had a lot of things go on, but we still kept the feast. We still tithed, whether third tithe year, regular tithe years, holy days, or whatever. We would do that. And also, by the way, other minor difficulties you face. As we got a little older, we could afford to go to restaurants more often than once every other month. And, you know, sometimes you go out to eat and there's almost nothing you can eat because either the main course is biblically unclean or they have things we can eat and they put in pork or shellfish or other types of things. But we don't just say, okay, we're going to forget all that kind of stuff. And the other thing we also didn't do is when apostasy hit in the old Worldwide Church of God, we didn't say, oh, well, it's okay. The church now says you don't have to keep the Sabbath. You can work on the Sabbath. You don't have to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, etc., etc. We didn't go along with the changes. They were not biblical. They were not consistent with what this book said. That was a difficulty that we faced a few times. Now, some people like to hear things, but not necessarily do them. And some people just don't have the faith in God that they should have. I was looking for a booklet that we had before called Faith. Faith for Those God Has Called and Chosen. I think I remember the title, but I've written lots of books. I don't remember every word of them. Again, this is available at ccog.org. As far as faith goes, I want to go to James chapter 1. start in verse 6. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose he'll receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. You have to have faith and be willing to step out on faith and be serious about it. I mentioned about education. As it turns out, I have somewhere close to 12 to 14 years of college/university education. Almost all of it came at night. And yes, I have some Sabbath difficulties. As a matter of fact, to get my PhD, forgot about that one, to get my PhD, they told me I couldn't do it because I had to attend on 2 Sabbaths for this to happen. And I consulted actually with Worldwide Church of God on this, their legal advisor, their lawyer, Ralph Helge. It's the only time I think I talked to him. And he told me to show up, except not on the Sabbaths. And I asked somebody if they would use a tape recorder to record the Sabbath sessions, and they did. And one of the professors there screamed at me, how dare I show up? How, I don't show up on the Sabbaths. I shouldn't get credit, blah, 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 blah. And whatever. But it turns out one of the other professors there married a Jew. Now he did show up on Saturday. As a matter of fact, the Jewish people in my entrance class also showed up on Saturday, but I didn't. And so he was sympathetic to my position, and as it turns out, the school did allow me to go through without the Sabbaths. And they had some other things that were also supposed to be on the Sabbath during the course program, and I never did. And again, I graduated. Yeah, it affected me a little bit, but that was fine. And by the way, it wasn't just myself. Our children always took time off for the Feast of Tabernacles. They've never missed one. They've always gone. And both of our older children, by the way, do have bachelor's degrees. So from worldly institutions, it wasn't like they went to some kind of a church college that would let them off. So yes, it is possible to get a formal education without violating the Sabbath or the holy days. Now I realize, particularly in places like the United States, they're getting less tolerant of religious freedom and rights, but I've been able to do it. Our children have been able to do it. You probably could do it as well. And if you can't, then you start somewhere else. Okay, the job my wife lost because she wouldn't violate God's law, and the fact that she did keep the Feast of Tabernacles. She didn't like the job really anyway, and it ended up things were better for her not being there. I'd like to go to James chapter 1. I was in there before. I want to go now down to verse 21. Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow with wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Now, some people have watched our videos for years. They don't send holy day offerings, they don't tithe, they don't show up at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, maybe they do other things God says. They probably don't eat pork. And I'm hoping that they don't bear false witness, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't murder, etc. Whether or not they're violating the first commandment, but God above all, is something that I wonder about. But again, James says, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. So apparently, James ran across people who would come to Sabbath services, listen to messages, but didn't necessarily put it into the practice into their life. So it's not just something that happens in the 21st century where people just watch stuff on the internet. Anyway, James says, for if anyone's a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in the mirror, for he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks in the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this is one will be blessed in what he does. A lot of people say they have faith. Well, if you're in James, let's go to James 2, verse 18. But some will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. It's one of the reasons I'm sharing these stories. The prospective member I was talking to said she found them inspiring and helpful as she's going to try to figure out about tithing and Feast of Tabernacles and various other things. And she says she believes, well, and it needs to turn into action. As far as belief, James says, look, you believe there's one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble, but they don't obey God as they should. But you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered Abraham his son on the altar? You see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect. At the beginning of this sermon, I talked about we're supposed to strive for perfection. And how do you do this? You put faith in action. So even if they tell you, you may lose your job, so you won't eat, or you go to jail, or whatever, we have to obey God rather than men. Anyway, Scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted for him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works, not faith only. That's one reason that Martin Luther didn't want this to be quoted. He called the book of James Epistle a straw because it violated something he made up. He said that you're saved by faith alone. He actually put that in the book of Romans, which is not true. Didn't say that in the book of Romans, but he discounted what it said in James, which is in flat contradiction. Matter of fact, that's probably one reason why I decided that on this particular book, we have a statue that's supposed to be of Polycarp. We don't really know what he looked like. And Martin Luther, that closer to what he looked like. To explain it, Martin Luther in Protestantism does not believe in sola scriptura. That is something I learned a long time ago. And others perhaps haven't learned that as well as they should. Otherwise they wouldn't be Protestant. In Proverbs 22, let's go to the book of Proverbs. I want to read something. In Proverbs 22, verse 13. The lazy man says, there's a lion outside. I'll be slain in the streets. So they don't take action that they're supposed to do. Now if you're in Proverbs 22, let's go to Proverbs 26, also verse 13. The lazy man says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion in the streets. Now you may not think you're a lazy man or woman. Are you willing to do what you're supposed to do? Or, like the lazy man, are you afraid? Because that's what this is. This lazy man is afraid. Let's go to the book of Luke. New Testament. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 22. Luke 12, 22. Then he, that's Jesus, said to his disciples, therefore I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat, nor about your body, what you'll put on. If you have faith in God and will tithe, for example, life is more than food and body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor barn. God feeds them. How much more value are you than the birds? Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to its stature? If you're not able to do the least, why are you anxious for the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They don't toil or spin. Yet I say to them, Solomon in all his glory isn't arrayed like one of these. So if God clothes the grass, which is today in the field and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? Hold up our faith booklet here. And do not seek what you should eat or what you should drink, nor have an anxious mind. For all these things the nations of the world seek. So the heathen feel this way. Your Father knows you need these things, but seek the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. Do not fear, little flock. There are people who are afraid to step out on faith and do what they should do. Now, before I go any further on this, there are people, bitter people, who were once part of the old worldwide Church of God, who turned against it, who feel that life was ruined because they tithed, they get second tithe or whatever. because they felt that the ministers told them if you tithe, the Bible says in Malachi, God's going to give you blessings. And they think, okay, they didn't get rich from this, they lost money, this is terrible. They've been bitter people ever since. My wife and I have been tithe payers for many decades. And in my case, I think 50 years or so. And we did not just become independently wealthy. We're still not independently wealthy. But our finances improved in time. It took years, decades, before we were a bit more comfortable, if you want to use that term. We had faith and we kept tithing anyway. We didn't say, okay, God, you only have this much time for you to get a blessing. But actually, in hindsight, you realize, wait a second. Despite the struggles, we did go to the Feast of Tabernacles every year. We got to go all kinds of places. Got to meet all kinds of church people all around the world. And we tithed. And we helped people, particularly the third tithe year. We got through it. One blessing was that we got through it. One of the tithing blessings, by the way, is it more or less sort of forces you to have to kind of budget. A lot of people don't want to budget. Kind of have to do that. You send the church a tithe and you hold a second tithe for yourself. Kind of forces you to budget and to get involved with savings and things like that. That does have a positive effect on you. So there are blessings, and God will provide. God knows what you need. After saying, don't fear, little flock, it's your Father's good pleasure to get in the kingdom, Jesus said, verse 33, sell what you have, give alms, provide your money bags which do not grow old, a treasure in heaven which doesn't fail, where no thief approaches or moth destroys. For where your treasure is, your heart is also. Yes, as Jesus said in Mark 11:22, have faith in God. A lot of people don't have faith in God. Now, the front cover of this booklet, you see, talking about walking on water. Now, whether this is supposed to be Jesus' feet or Peter's feet, I don't recall, and I should know because we had to actually pay a royalty to use a small royalty to be able to pay this, use this picture. Now, a lot of people criticize Peter because they say he didn't have enough faith and he started to sink and Jesus picked him up. But Peter must have had an awful lot of faith to say, Lord, if it's you, bid me to come and walk on the water. Would you take a step out on water, on a lake, out of a sea that's harsh or whatever? Would you step out of a boat on there? Peter did. He said faith to take one step. Hopefully you have faith to take not only one step, but to continue with the walk. Peter stumbled. So Jesus did not say, Peter, you're totally useless. I can't use you anymore. He didn't say anything like that. He said, you needed to have faith and whatever. And in time, Peter ended up with more. You may stumble. You may step out on faith, which Peter did, and you might stumble. Now, we all stumble, and we all make mistakes, but it doesn't mean we're supposed to give up. In Joshua, you don't have to go there, but Joshua 24, he says, you guys have to decide. Are you going to do the way of the pagan or God's way? He says, but for me and my house, we'll serve God. There's only two ways. If you're not going to do it God's way, you're doing it Satan's way. And even if you are an actual Christian, Jesus warned about it being a lukewarm one. He said he spit you out of his mouth. In Deuteronomy 30, you don't have to go there. People are told, set before you today life and good, death and evil. And we should love God and his ways. And they'll go well with us. Otherwise, you'll be cursed. Doesn't mean, again, you won't have any problems. One problem I happen to think of that I was going to talk about earlier had to do with our oldest child. A couple of years when he would go to school, he would get pinched badly on St. Patrick's Day. And it was coming up one year, and he came up to me and talked to me about it. said he was worried about Patrick's Day, he called it. And so I actually wrote his teacher a note explaining how, we're not Catholic and we shouldn't be persecuted and pinched. So son doesn't want to go to school this day because he's going to get pinched too much. And anyway, that took care of it. And so we didn't have that in the future. Now, are things always supposed to be easy? No, I'm going to read Acts 21 verse 22, which states, "We must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God." Now, I didn't go through every one that myself, or definitely not my wife or our children went through personally. But yeah, throughout my previous careers, I had issues. I had people resenting me not going to certain things on the Sabbath that other people had to do. But that was not the right way. We have to go God's way. Now, I left our old church, as people know, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically because of two things. One, they intentionally said they were not going to keep promises. They broke promises, so they were bearing false witness. And they willingly set out information to their members that they knew was wrong. And they told me they knew it was wrong. And Jeremiah 48:10 says, "Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord deceitfully." You say, well, that's just about the work overall. But no, your own life also is the work of the Lord. You're not supposed to do it deceitfully. Now, when we ended up leaving that church, we didn't know what we were going to expect. The Bible talks about counting the cost. Jesus talked about that. And in our case, I was concerned what we would do for income. Unlike other Church of God leaders who, when they went out most of the time to start other groups, they already had a group of tithe payers or support them, so they felt they had some things arranged. That wasn't the case with Joyce and I. We hadn't gone out and asked others if they would support us, because it was kind of a last minute thing, because we weren't planning on doing this. And we just stepped out on faith. Now, I was concerned that perhaps our income from our business might drop in half. And I thought, well, if it drops in half, we'll squeak by, because the taxes will be a little less, tithes will be less, we'll squeak by. As it turns out, that didn't happen. We were blessed. Matter of fact, blessed so much that, to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only leader of an American headquartered Church of God with more than 500 people. We've got over 5,000, who doesn't take a salary from the church. And by the way, nor does my wife Joyce. So we were blessed. We stepped out on faith, and we're blessed. But just because we did the right thing, you can read all kinds of terrible things about me on the internet that aren't true, mostly from people who don't know me. And let me just read what Jesus said, though, about that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 11. "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." Now, this has happened to me, and it's probably happened to some of you. Some of your family members will say things falsely. You probably won't have a bunch of websites that go out and say things against you almost every day or every day. And I saw, by the way, another post against me today before I did this, because I taught from Scripture about Christians shouldn't fear. Jesus said, "Fear not, little flock." Okay? I'm criticized for that. Anyway. But Jesus said, when this happens, verse 12, "Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." We all need to step out on faith. As I said before, Peter actually at least did take an initial step. He stumbled, but he still came back. And God was able to use him to preach. He was the apostle to the Israelites. Do you have the faith to step out on water? Of course, humanly that's impossible without some kind of a miracle, or unless the water is frozen. But you physically can take steps to obey God. For example, if you don't think you can afford to go to the Feast of Tabernacles because you don't have enough money, you can start to collect your second tithe. You say, but it doesn't amount to much. Okay, maybe you won't have enough the first year to go. I barely squeaked by my first year, but I was able to do it. So save that money, and then the next year. And with that, then hopefully you can go. And if not, if you're even poorer, wait the next year. It can be done if you'll take small steps. Sometimes you have to take very big steps, and sometimes small steps. But you have to have faith. It is possible to live, strive to obey God's law, not do schoolwork on the Sabbath, which I never did, not starve because you might lose a job. I did not work on the Sabbath. After I learned enough about the Sabbath, I didn't go to my regular job on the Sabbath. Yeah, I was hungry a few times. Okay, I got through that. Obey God rather than men. Don't compromise the Sabbath. Don't compromise the holy days. Start to tithe. Take small steps. Attend the Feast of Tabernacles. Live as a true Christian. And for more information about, at least an overview, on how to live as a Christian, again, I'll recommend our free book, Christians Ambassadors for the Kingdom of God. This is a booklet that the lady I was counseling with did read and was rereading, and things were making more and more sense to her. And by telling her the stories that I did, I think it helped her have faith to take some steps that she needs to take, and many of us all need to take. We need to walk by faith, not by sight, as the Apostle Paul wrote. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.